Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon,
Y muchas gracias a todos
and thank you to everyone for coming here this afternoon. I think it's going to be a very interesting conference. It talks about a reality that we might think that we know, but at the same time we have certain concepts in our mind, prejudices that sometimes do not correspond to the reality on site. We tend to relate hunger with a drought, with natural disasters, or with an unfair wealth distribution. These are causes of hunger, but more and more, especially in the Middle East and in the north of Africa, hunger is the direct consequence of armed conflicts. At the beginning of April, at Brussels, the 2019 report on food crisis was presented. Nowadays, 130 million people suffer acute hunger. Two-thirds live in countries that are affected by insecurity and conflicts. There's an undeniable evidence, and this is that violence is the main cause of acute hunger worldwide. There's also a United Nations Security Council resolution from last year that establishes the link between armed conflicts, violence, and food insecurity. This resolution condemns the use of hunger as a war method that can be considered a war crime. So we're also talking about human rights. As a Televisión Española journalist and correspondent in the region, I've been able to witness this on the field, how conflict can lead to poverty and food insecurity. I saw this in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's happening in Yemen in tragic terms, even if this is not talked about. I visited this country in 2011 during the so-called Arab Spring in Yemen with 28 million inhabitants. And this country, acutely food insecure people, so in a crisis emergency situation, more than 20 million out of 28 million people are in the situation. We've received tragic images. We can all probably remember images of malnourished children that are very, very hard to watch. Behind these figures, 20 million people, there are always lives, and we have to be able to think about all these lives. In Palestine, in the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, 2/3 of the population suffers food insecurity. I've been able to witness the worsening of their situation, how they've become poorer and poorer until they've reached a situation of food emergency and total despair. It is a population that nowadays suffers one of the highest unemployment rates worldwide, 46% according to official numbers. If we talk about younger women, it's up to 90% unemployment, and this means that there's no way out, no way of earning money, and there's a lot of dependency on humanitarian aid. This is one of the examples where we can see that this situation is not the consequence of catastrophe. It is caused by us, by human beings. The blockage, conflict in the Gaza Strip is leading to the impoverishment of the population. Nicolas Oberlin has been able to witness this relationship between conflicts and hunger. He is the Deputy Regional Director for Middle East, North of Africa, Central Asia and Eastern Europe from the World Food Programme, many regions. He supervises the answer of the program to humanitarian situations. He's got wide experience. Oberlin is an experienced humanitarian and development professional with more than 20 years' work in United Nations and international NGOs. During his 20 years in the World Food Programme, he has worked at the headquarters and in the field. It is important to mention this because not only has he got the joint vision of the organization in different positions, but also in the field from different places where you can really see directly how the population is suffering directly the consequences of that situation in countries such as Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Nicolas Oberlin graduated at ESSEC school in France and at the School of International and Public Affairs of Colombia, and currently he lives in Cairo. I'm not going to talk much longer. I'm going to give him the floor because we're here to listen to him.
Muchas gracias, Yolanda. I'm sorry that my Spanish is not very good, so you're going to have to listen to me in English with a French accent. Thank you very, very much, Yolanda, for being with us tonight, and thank you very much to the Casa Árabe for welcoming this type of conference and other events that happen today around the Middle East and in particular hunger in the Middle East too. This morning we had a very interesting discussion about Palestine, as a matter of fact. As we discuss hunger and conflict tonight, and as I would like to give you my perspective, but also the perspective of the United Nations World Food Programme, let me introduce to you the World Food Programme, which we call WFP. WFP was established in 1961, and it responded for the first time to an emergency in September 62, and this was an earthquake that happened in Iran, which killed 12,000 people back in 1962. As a matter of fact, last week, the World Food Programme received a request from the Iranian Red Crescent to respond to the floods that have happened there, the very serious floods. And I've actually noticed that they were asking for a food ration which included tea, which we don't normally deliver, but we delivered tea to Iran as part of the food ration back in 1962 already. WFP became a fully fledged member of the United Nations as a program in 1965, and I think that's better, and or maybe it's too much. You tell me. And we have been responding to food crisis ever since. And at the same time, we recognize that food and nutrition are also essential components of development, not just in emergencies, obviously. And one very critical way the World Food Programme is developing food security in non-conflict, in non-crisis context is school meals, school feeding programs. And this is something we do in addition to responding to emergencies in the Middle East. We have school feeding programs which involve millions of children throughout the Middle East and North Africa in particular. So over time, there was no lack, sadly, of food security crisis that WFP had to respond to. This was the Western Sahel famines in 1970, for instance, the famine in Ethiopia, and Operation Lifeline Sudan in the 1980s. Then in the 90s, we had Yugoslavia, Kosovo, and also the Great Lakes conflict, which created massive displacement and food insecurity issues around eastern Congo. and Rwanda. In the 90s, North Korea, as some of us might remember, faced a major food insecurity situation. And Iraq also in the 90s, after the first Gulf War, and this is continuing to this day as a matter of fact. And in this decade, as we all know, we are responding to the major crisis in Syria and around Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, etc. And we will discuss this in more details later. So what does the World Food Programme do exactly? We save lives in emergency situations. That's about 90% of our budget, and WFP's budget is about $6 billion on a yearly basis. 90% of our budget is spent on responding to emergencies, which leaves 10% to development work. This we do through delivering food in kind in emergency to save lives, as I say, when no other option is possible. And this is now the mode of assistance we have, for instance, in Yemen and Syria. The World Food Programme is delivering food in kind to people in need. But what's happened recently in the last few years is that we have massively changed our approach to providing cash to people, as opposed to food in kind. This is not always possible, because if food is not available to buy in the country, obviously money is not going to help to find food. So the conditions have to be right. There has to be a functioning market. There has to be availability of food. But if this is the case, and if people's problem is that they cannot afford the food, then it's a much better way to provide assistance, to give people the freedom to buy what they want, sometimes from shops that are selected, sometimes with limitations on the number of items or the nature of the items they can buy, but it's a huge progress in respecting people's dignity, people's possibility to choose. And what's a major benefit of assisting people with cash is that this money is literally getting into the economy of Lebanon, Jordan, for instance, when assistance to the Syrian refugees in these countries is delivered through cash transfers. The World Food Programme, since the beginning of the Syria crisis, has transferred about $5 billion into the economies of Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, through the assistance provided to the Syrian refugees in these countries, including Syria itself. But as I said, there are many limitations inside Syria for using cash, because Syria is under sanctions, and the financial operators are not operating inside Syria at the moment. So this is why we have to resort to food assistance in kind, food packages for Syrians inside the country. Another job of WFP is to improve nutrition, which means that food is not just about the quantity or energy, but also the quality and the nutritional value of the food. So that's a core element of our work. And this is particularly targeted at children and at women, in particular during and after a pregnancy. Another very important element of our work is that we focus on the poorest. This is always, there has to be an order of priority, or the most food insecure, and as I mentioned, women, children, because sadly there has to be a prioritization, because the resources are not infinite. 800 million people suffer from hunger at this moment in the world, and as was mentioned in the introduction, we're able to assist only about 80 or 100 million, which is already a lot, but that's only 10% of the needs. Which is not to say that everyone suffering from food insecurity should, that the solution is necessarily food aid, but still only 10% of the problem is addressed by the World Food Programme. What's also important is that we offer durable solutions and not just short-term assistance. So we're definitely trying to do this every time it's possible. We work with governments, with local authorities, with communities to develop policies, to develop markets, services, infrastructure, so that communities and countries are enabled to be self-reliant and what we call resilient. And what is a good example of this is what I mentioned earlier, is, for instance, school meals in schools. This is definitely a way to capitalize and to demultiply the impact of food. Now, focusing on the Middle East and North Africa, this region is a very sad example, actually, of how in recent years, that's the last 10 or 20 years, conflict has created hunger, which wasn't there before. You mentioned my work earlier. I used to work in this region around the year 2001, and as an anecdote, the Middle East region in the World Food Programme was covering also Afghanistan and Pakistan, because we would not have had enough work if we did not include these countries in our portfolio of countries, which now are no longer under us, they're under Asia. But very sadly, we do not need Afghanistan and Pakistan now for North Africa and the Middle East to give us a lot of work, sadly. And this has changed, in the early years of 2000 with the crisis in Iraq to start with, and with the conflicts that we've just mentioned now recently. As a matter of fact, our region now corresponds to 40% of WFP's worldwide budget. So this region really is almost half of everything WFP does in the world today. And this is obviously very sad. I mean, we all know the name that was given to this area in the Middle East that ranges from Syria to Mesopotamia in ancient times. Of course, it was called the Fertile Crescent. And this is precisely this Fertile Crescent that was ravaged by war, starting in the 90s in Iraq, and then in the last decade in Syria. As a result, I mean, the entire population of Iraq, since the mid-90s, has to receive food rations. Every single citizen in Iraq receives food rations under something that's called the public distribution system. We will mention this later. Syria has gone from being a net exporter of wheat, for instance, to not being able to cover its need at the moment. And at the moment, as a matter of fact, 12 million people in Syria are in need of humanitarian assistance, and 6.5 are suffering from food insecurity. And the World Food Programme is managing to assist just over 4 million people inside Syria at the moment. And these effects of conflict are not mentioning the massive displacements that we have seen in the recent years, which are said to be the largest since the Second World War. This is also not to mention Yemen, which has brought, where the conflict has brought the country to the brink of famine. We know that 20 million, as you mentioned, people, that's 2/3 of the 28 or 30 million people in Yemen who are suffering from food insecurity, and WFP is assisting 12 million people in this country on a daily basis with their daily food needs. And then we have Libya, and then we have Palestine, and then we have Sudan as well. And we will mention these countries a bit later. So, political tensions, sectarianism, conflicts in the region, this is one thing, but they're often combined with other factors, such as high dependency on food imports. Yemen, has always had to import 90% of its food. It's a lot. So this makes also the country extremely vulnerable to to disruptions in trade, in access, when 90% of your food needs have to come from outside. It's a very delicate balance to maintain. Environmental degradation is also a factor in increasing food insecurity, climate shocks, resource scarcity, poor governance, and rising social inequalities. So, this creates, sadly, in this region at the moment, in particular, a unique and complex political and humanitarian landscape, which generates a lot of misery and which makes it also very difficult to assist when your role is to help with these very dramatic issues. And whenever possible, as I mentioned before, WFP, but also every other actor in the humanitarian and development world is making every effort to bring solutions that will last, if possible, and not be too short-lived, working with people, communities, governments, rather than from the outside. And that involves working with markets, improving supply chains, food chains in particular, working with local producers and rather than importing food. As I mentioned, it has to do also with working with cash rather than food that's imported into the country. It has a lot to do also with what we call social protection or social safety nets, which are ways to protect people beyond shocks or conflicts or situations of emergency in their everyday life when they are vulnerable. And basically, it often has to do with bringing solutions that will themselves, I believe, contribute to, not to resolve conflicts, but to bring, to an extent, a measure of peace and security, which is the only way to address the dramatic circumstances. Now, hunger and conflict in particular, there is, as you mentioned, Yolanda, an undeniable correlation between hunger and conflict. I think you mentioned that 60% of the world's hungry people live in conflict areas. Wars are extremely damaging. They destroy supply chains, they destroy markets, livelihoods, and they create lasting damage to agricultural production. They push food prices up, they limit access to food, and that's not just food, but also fuel or water, which has an impact, obviously, on food production and availability as well. And all of this contributes to a food crisis. As a matter of fact, it's often not direct violence that causes the most damage in conflicts. Even if this is already horrific, it's been shown that for every person who dies as a direct consequence of a conflict, you have 4 people who die of hunger and disease that's generated by the conflict. So 4 times as many deaths from hunger and disease than who dies directly from violence related to conflict. So, obviously both sides are dramatic, but this is to give a sense of the huge damage that's done by conflict. And Syria and Yemen obviously are very dramatic illustrations of this at the moment. So this obviously is a huge challenge, in particular in this region, to progress and development in general, social development, economic development. The World Bank, I believe, estimates that by 2030, half the global poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected situations. And I don't know which is which. Obviously, if conflict makes you poor or being poor generates conflict. But the fact is that this is truly a combination that very much hurts. So you might say that the problem then is war and conflict, not poverty or hunger. And you would be right, this is true. But the correlation between the two is so high that when your job and your mandate as a United Nations agency is to fight hunger and poverty, it really means that you also have to take the problem at its roots and confront conflict. You have to deal with this if you want to resolve the problem. And that's with relief assistance, but also through prevention, advocacy, recovery work, and as I mentioned, long-term solution. And that means dealing with what we have been calling complex humanitarian emergencies that have developed in the recent years, where the political, the ethnic, the confessional aspects have all got mixed together to make really explosive situations, and we have a lot of those at the moment in the Middle East. And actually, you also mentioned this, Yolanda, and I think this is really a breakthrough. The Security Council of the United Nations passed a resolution recently, the Resolution 2417, which you mentioned, which recognizes, really affirms the very strong link between hunger and conflict. And what's even more important, it requests the United Nations to, and this is, in the first place, the World Food Programme, to report urgently to the Security Council every time when there is a situation where an armed conflict risks to create famine or really very, very damaging food and widespread food insecurity. And of course, that's with the intention that this famine or this situation can be prevented on time. And this was directly inspired by the situation in Yemen, as a matter of fact. What the Security Council resolution also does is that it strongly condemns the use of starvation as a method of warfare in a number of conflict situations, and as something that's always been, as long as the international humanitarian law has been in existence, that's absolutely prohibited. And we'll touch upon this subject a bit later. Before we do that, and actually I think a good way to get after my presentation, which I hope you will not find too long, a good way to get into a discussion is I would like to mention the situation in a number of countries in our region and highlight what are the specificities of these conflicts with respect to food insecurity, to hunger, and with respect also to the way the World Food Programme and others are having to assist, because each of these situations has its specificities, and I think it makes for a rather interesting picture, and a very varied picture with obviously a number of common threads. I will start with Syria. Syria has experienced an incredible regression due to the conflict there. It used to be rather, from an economic point of view, a rather thriving country, middle-income country, as we call them. And now 83% of the population in Syria lives under the poverty line. So this is what conflict did to Syria. 80% of the youth in Syria is unemployed, and that's 50% on average for all people of working age. 12 million people in the country need humanitarian assistance. 6.5 million are food insecure. I mentioned earlier the huge drop in agricultural production. As a matter of fact, the wheat harvest last year in Syria was the lowest since 1989. And of course, this is due to everything a conflict can do to irrigation, inputs, fuel, workforce, not to mention the markets, the food chains, and everything. Outlets have been disrupted. The prices of food in Syria are 7 times higher than the average of the last 5 years before the war. 7 times higher. This has actually improved last year for the first time, but still they are 7 times higher, which we can imagine the impact on people. And this is why at the moment we are assisting 4.5 million people in Syria with daily food rations. What are the typical features of the food insecurity situation in Syria and assisting with this situation? I think one of the main, and you are all aware of this, and this was something the World Food Programme experienced very much, it's been an issue of access, accessing people in need of humanitarian assistance. There was another breakthrough resolution by the Security Council of the United Nations. It's the number 2165. This was a Security Council resolution which allowed humanitarian assistance to be delivered from outside Syria to the areas that were not accessible from inside because they were controlled by non-government forces. So basically, humanitarian actors were authorized to enter Syria without the permission of the Syrian government in the interest, obviously, of saving lives, which, these people could not have been reached otherwise. So this Security Council resolution allowed this. It also created a monitoring mechanism at the same time, whereby on the border, what you would have in your truck would be controlled, because that's the least you could do so that the Syrian government would not... you had to be able to show that what was going into the country was indeed humanitarian goods and not weapons, for instance. Yeah? So this was the compensation for breaking the sovereignty, if you will, of Syria and allowing assistance to get into the country. As a matter of fact, you have this as well, to an extent, it's a bit different, but for Yemen as well, a verification mechanism was also installed by the UN to check on ships which are getting to the Yemeni ports, especially to Hodeidah port, to also check that the cargo of these ships is truly what it is supposed to be, essentially food or and obviously what we are looking for there is weapons. Yeah? So likewise, a system has been put in place to verify what's entering the country. And this is the price to pay, if you will, to be able to bring humanitarian aid. So what this resolution for Syria made possible is to deliver aid mostly from Turkey to the north and east of Syria, and also to the south of Syria from Jordan, yeah? and to a lesser extent from Lebanon. And to this day, even now that a large part of the Syrian territory has now been regained and is by the government and is under government control, to this day, assistance to Syrian people inside Syria is still 20% coming cross-border and 80% coming from inside Syria, but still this channel, if you will, is alive at the moment. Yeah? Another characteristic of the conflict in Syria is, as we have all heard, and in the case of the World Food Programme, we really experienced this on the ground, and that's not to say that Syrian people experienced it in their flesh. It's the fact that some areas were besieged by different sides to basically to starve them, and that's not just food, it's water, it's medicines, etc., and to force them to surrender, if you will. So some areas were besieged on purpose, as I mentioned, just for this purpose of having them surrender. We all remember Aleppo, of course, where the situation was very dramatic. There was eastern Ghouta around Damascus. There was Daraya also that we know about. There were areas, and it was literally not possible to access these places. Or very rarely a convoy was authorized. And it was not until the siege was lifted that you literally had access. And we've all heard what was happening in these areas, because obviously it was very, very, very dramatic. For this area of eastern Ghouta outside Damascus, again, a Security Council resolution was calling for a humanitarian pause of 1 month so that assistance could be delivered and the combats and the fighting would cease, and obviously the siege would be lifted, but this was never implemented. And maybe you heard about Libya. in the last few days. Likewise, what the international community has been calling for, the UN in particular, the humanitarian coordinator in Libya, has been calling also for a pause in the offensive by General Haftar, but he hasn't heard, obviously. Some other areas in Syria were not, just happened to be isolated by fighting, or by the way territory was changing. This was the case of Deir ez-Zor on the Euphrates in the east of the country. So there, the World Food Programme, what we were able to do is to do airdrops of food into the city, because the city could not be accessed by surface. You know? And this lasted for more than 6 months, I believe, until control was regained. Actually, this city of Deir ez-Zor was was surrounded by ISIS or Daesh, and the population could not be reached by land, and so we had to use airdrops of food into the city. Yeah. You know, to be fair, we also had to obviously deal with the government of Syria. I mean, movements of food and convoys inside Syria, obviously not to the places they had decided to besiege, because there was no way to break these sieges, or very exceptionally, authorizations had to be obtained from the government. A lot of insistence, and for instance, what the government decided at some point, because of political reasons, is that food could not be imported from Turkey into Syria, and most of WFP's food assistance to Syria was coming from Turkey, because Turkey is a very large producer. We actually procure food in Turkey for the entire world, and obviously it's next door, and so on. But the Syrian government decided that that forced us to find our supplies elsewhere, sometimes very far away, probably, certainly at a higher cost. And what was extremely difficult, of course, is that since you could not buy and cross the border, you sometimes had and this is what's happening to this day, it's a 3 to 4 months time period between buying the food somewhere and the food being available for assistance inside Syria. So you constantly have to plan 4 months in advance. Resources are not always easy to find. These programs cost a lot of money. The assistance in Yemen, for instance, is costing $150 million a month, every month. So we're talking of $2 billion a year. So, and this money has to be available at the right time, because if it's not available today, it means it will have an impact in 4 months' time. Yeah. So for Yemen, for instance, we constantly have to have 1 month on its way, 1 month in stock, and 1 month on the sea, because there again, the time is about 3 to 4 months between purchase and delivery, distribution to beneficiaries inside Yemen. Of course, in Syria now, what is going to be very critical is the return of refugees into Syria. So this is going to pose an additional challenge, even though indications at the moment, you ask Syrian refugees in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, to a large extent, they don't intend to return very soon, but there are, hundreds or thousands of returns, every month. Of course, we're talking of a refugee population that's probably around 6 million. So there is no sign quite yet of massive returns, and our partner in this crisis, the High Commissioner for Refugees, HCR, is in any case not recommending that refugees should return because the conditions in Syria in terms of protection are not met for people to be able to return safely. Not to mention that the economic situation there, the destruction of houses, etc., makes it extremely difficult, obviously, for people to get back their lives and in Syria. But this is something the HCR, the World Food Programme, UNICEF, everybody is working to be ready to assist people when and if they will return. And what is happening as we speak is that you have millions of internally displaced people inside Syria who are likewise returning to their place of origin. So it's not just the refugees outside the country, but millions of people have been displaced inside Syria, and they also need assistance, obviously, to get back to their place of origin. I think I have a very quick video on Syria. That's a bit, there's not much, it doesn't say very much, but yeah, it's Aleppo and Eastern Ghouta, the places I mentioned earlier and that you know. This is Homs, yeah, and this is irrigation, or used to be irrigation.
حصلت على هالبلد حتى البيئة تلوثت.
The war that has caused the farmers to have to flee, destroying irrigation systems, it's just been a disaster. What's making things worse is now we're having a drought. It is just a bad situation on top of a catastrophe. So we need all the help we can get so that these people can survive, so that these people can have a future, so that these children will have a brighter future as well.
Yes, something sorry, it's a bit, but it gives a sense, but it's a bit, how do you say, edited. But what you saw also is a bakery. WFP has helped, rebuild and operate bakeries which had been completely, destroyed and not operating, and this obviously provided bread for the population, but also jobs. So this is the kind of things we're trying to do. In addition to, obviously, to in-kind assistance. And what we are also trying to do in Syria now, but it's not easy, is to move, as I mentioned earlier, from in-kind assistance to these 4 million people to cash assistance, to have the benefits that I mentioned that are associated with cash assistance. As a matter of fact, this is assistance is provided to over 1.5 million refugees from Syria in Turkey, to about 700,000 Syrian refugees in Lebanon, about the same number of Syrian refugees in Jordan, by WFP and partners through cash vouchers. These are literally little credit cards where cash is uploaded every month for the family, and with which the refugees can shop in designated shops, or in some cases just get cash from bancomat. I don't know how you call them in Spain, ATM. And so this is amazing, honestly, and And what is amazing, truly amazing, is that if you make cash available, not the system that we have in Lebanon, for instance, where you go to a shop and you can only buy food with the card. If you are able to withdraw cash, people buy food with it, because the argument has always been that if you give money, then, people will buy cigarettes or God knows what, and it will not go to what's essential. But I think it's pretty sad, because it means that these people truly, are desperate for food, and even if they have cash in their hand, they spend 90% of it on food. Yeah, but with a lot more flexibility on which shop they can go to, which food they can buy, than if they were given by us, because we decide this is what you need. They can decide what they need. So, as I said, this is the way to provide assistance in the host countries for refugees, but in Syria it's not yet the case because of sanctions, because the financial services are not up and running. Also, what's difficult is in terms of technology, because we now introduced also biometrics, so that people can be identified as the owner of this card and this entitlement, instead of being able to pass it on to people who would not be entitled. Yeah, this might be considered a little bit intrusive. I don't know, but when you see that in Yemen, for instance, I mentioned $2 billion a year. I mean, the generosity of donor countries, including Spain, in assisting these countries, this generosity. I mean, we have to be able to show that this is really reaching the people who need it, and this is why, with the help of technology, things are getting a lot more precise and reliable than they used to be. And I think it's really a progress. Very quickly, because it would be nice to have a discussion, I can mention what is very specific about Yemen, in addition to what I've mentioned before. You have every situation in Syria. We've mentioned how you had to deal with the government or go across borders. In countries that are hosting refugees from Syria, the situation is also very delicate vis-à-vis the governments, because this high number of refugees, and especially in Lebanon, where the refugee population is about 1/3 of the population of Lebanon. You can imagine the pressure on Lebanon's public services, job market, schools, etc. So this is the issue that we have as WFP to deal with when we provide assistance in Lebanon or in Jordan. And of course in Yemen the situation is yet different, where you have a legitimate government, so to speak, and de facto a government in Sana'a. And obviously as an impartial and neutral humanitarian actor, we are having to deal with both sides to reach people wherever they are and under whomever's authority they are, the rebels, if you will, or the internationally recognized government of Yemen. And both sides are, of course, not happy with us, the internationally recognized government, when we provide assistance to the rebel-controlled areas, but we are not providing assistance to the rebels, we're providing assistance to people who live and suffer in rebel-controlled areas. And likewise, the rebel side is also accusing us of siding with the other side. So I have to say that we've had to be very tough with both sides. Both sides are making it difficult for us to operate because they have strategic interests. They want to win the war, so what we have to do is not always helpful for them to serve their objectives. They suspend the humanitarian air service that WFP is operating, claiming that it's bringing the wrong people in. They make it very difficult for us to import, equipment. That's cars, that's security equipment, IT equipment is very sensitive. So really, it's a negotiation every single day, and that's at the level of the authorities. That's not to mention the negotiations you have to have on the ground, to access 12 million people. Imagine in a country that's a very difficult country to get around, even in peacetime. So Yemen is very, very, very challenging, also for the size of it. And I found a quote of our executive director. You saw him on the short video earlier. In September 2018, he made it very clear that the World Food Programme was condemning any attempt to use humanitarian aid and facilities as a tool of war. And this was again, just like the Security Council resolution you mentioned, this was again, in the context of Yemen, where both sides are trying to use food and access to food as a weapon of war. Last thing on Yemen, you all know about the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea, which is where, as I mentioned earlier, Yemen imports 90% of its food, and more than half of it has to reach the northern part of the country, and the entry point is Hodeidah. Hodeidah is not just, as a result, it is a very strategic point. If you control Hodeidah, you control basically supplies into the country, you control supplies into the capital, Sana'a, and it is therefore a very precious target in the war. The problem is that if Hodeidah is disrupted, then it's the entire population that's going to suffer even more, because neither aid will be able to get in, nor commercial imports. So I must say, the World Food Programme, we have been extremely active at a very high level to be able to keep this entry point into this lifeline, to keep it open and free of fighting or still operating. And as you know, I think we have been largely successful. We have been largely heard, and of course, Hodeidah was the object of a lot of the negotiations in the peace discussions that were held in Stockholm in November last year, where the two sides agreed a number of measures towards peace. And Hodeidah was a very central. We hope this holds and gets better even. Otherwise, we're going to have a very big problem in controlling the situation with respect to hunger and famine. Iraq, very quickly. Iraq is a very interesting situation when it comes to conflict and hunger. As you know, the first Gulf War was followed by sanctions imposed on Iraq in the 90s, in the early 90s. And sanctions, as often, have very serious side effects in actually targeting the population rather than the regime. Sanctions, which have to do with usually import restrictions, etc. So what was put in place is what we all know is called the Oil for Food program, whereby Iraq was allowed to sell its oil, but whoever was buying it had to put the money with the United Nations, and the United Nations would then purchase aid, essentially food and medicines, with the money generated by the oil sales. But the money didn't go to the government of Iraq, it stayed in a UN account. And what was very interesting, because as I mentioned, I was already working in this region at that time, what was very interesting is that when the Second World War, Iraq War, Gulf War, started in 2003, the United States knew that this Oil for Food program, what it put in place is this public distribution system whereby every single Iraqi, rich or poor, was entitled to a full food ration every month. You know? So from 1995, this is, and until the 2003 war, this was the system in place. So when the war was about to start in 2003, the United States were very careful to make sure that this system would not be disrupted by the war, because it would have meant that overnight the supply routes of 30 million people would have been cut, and they were relying. It's already difficult when you are shopping and the markets are no longer supplied or the prices have gone up, but if you are literally getting your food package from the shop as an entitlement every month and this stops, then there are almost no way to compensate. So I must say, and this is not a judgment, but I must say that the United States made sure that this system would continue to function, because they knew that, I mean, this is, I'm not sure if you can call this a weapon of war. It's actually the other way. I mean, it's recognizing that food is an essential component of people's well-being, and if you cut them off from this, I mean, it has very, very serious consequences. So I think that's an interesting aspect. Unfortunately, this public distribution system, we're talking of 2003, the Second Gulf War, and we are now more than 15 years later. This is still in place in Iraq. Despite the fact that the sanctions are gone, despite the fact that Iraq has, as we know, I mean, lots of its own resources too, but Iraq has known conflict again with Daesh and large parts of the country being controlled by Daesh until 2017, I believe. Mosul in particular, massive displacements, which, by the way, made this whole public distribution system not very functional, because when you are no longer living where you're supposed to live. So Iraq has been in a big mess, if I may say, to this day, and this public distribution system had to be in place, way beyond what it was supposed to address, which is the original sanctions against Iraq. The World Food Program nowadays is helping the government of Iraq to digitalize the public distribution system, to have cards, as I mentioned, biometrics, to be able to identify people as the owner of the cards, because until now, even though it is serving millions of people, it was managed in a way that wasn't, fully accountable, let's say. So we're providing support to the government of Iraq, the Ministry of Trade, to improve, if you will, the process of the public distribution system. And there are also issues of targeting. Obviously, you would want to target people who need it the most, rather than have too wide a range of people. The cost is enormous for not so many benefits. Okay, I will, very quickly, since Libya is also on the agenda, just to explain to you very briefly what is the situation there from the point of view of the World Food Program. Libya, in many ways, has a lot of similarities with Iraq, because it's also a middle-income country with lots of reserves in oil and income, yet conflict and insecurity, just like was the case in Iraq until very recently, is disrupting everything. People in Libya have money, but it's in the bank. There's an issue with liquidity, so you can afford food, but and it's on the market, but you don't have anything to pay for it. So situations are sometimes really, really, really absurd. So there again, you need to find appropriate solutions. An additional problem in Libya is the very high number of migrants that live in Libya. The unofficial figures are, above 1 million, again, for a population of, I think, 6 million. And And really, as we've heard actually in the last few days, the conflict is hurting more these people who are in very fragile situations because they are illegal, because they are discriminated against, because obviously they are fragile and poor. The conflict is first and foremost hurting them, which is a very, unusual situation, if you will, because you have an entire population that's affected in a strange way, to be honest. So we're again trying to assist there. It's difficult as we speak, because our international staff had to be evacuated this afternoon to Tunisia. But WFP is pre-positioning. We're pre-positioning food in mostly around Tripoli with partners, so that it can be, again, mostly to be given to displaced people if they need it. Palestine, we discussed at length, but maybe some of you were not here this morning, is another, obviously, situation that's made very delicate by conflict, and this is this time a very protracted conflict situation, if you will. The situation there is extremely serious, especially in Gaza, a lot more than in the West Bank when it comes to, again, our business, which is food security. 70% of the population of Gaza is food insecure. Half of the population is severely food insecure. I mean, this is a level that's higher, if it's not really comparable, but than Yemen, literally for this population of 2 million in Gaza. What the World Food Programme does there is that it is looking after people in Gaza and the West Bank who don't have the refugee status. UNRWA, whom you know, are looking after refugees, as we know, Palestinian refugees, even outside Palestine. But in Palestine, the World Food Programme is looking after the food security of non-refugees. In Gaza, for instance, 1/3 of the population does not have refugee status. So we are again the lifeline for these people in Gaza. I will mention very quickly, a bit in the same, not in the same, but talking of protracted situations and, not quite related to conflict, but one thing I wanted to mention is the Sahrawi situation in the south of Algeria. There again, the World Food Programme, together with HCR, is really the lifeline of the Sahrawi refugees when it comes to food in the middle of the desert, with significant support in particular from the Spanish Corporation and other donors. So we're really grateful for this. Sorry, I've talked for a very long time. But my idea was to just give you examples so that we could have a discussion, and we are going to have a discussion, I hope. But, what I would like to say just in conclusion really is that the cause of all this misery is conflict. And day in and day out, as the World Food Programme and many others are working on alleviating this immense suffering that's caused by conflict. You have to think that really the solution is political, and which is not our job, but we are doing all we can to advocate, obviously, for the end of this situation, so that the suffering would disappear. And really, this region is in big need of big political solutions. It's not looking too good, probably, in my opinion, at least in the short term. But we should all work towards it. So, thank you very much.